Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who is spending his free time killing his other 664 brothers from another mother.
Tim Longo. Yes, I have started my quest.
That's good.
And I'm on my way. And about to start Baldur's Gate 2 and then 3 and then wow. Yeah, I mean if they that's really, we talked about it last time, but it's so funny like to think that that's the franchise. Right. That they're just going to start, they're just going to like somehow work through that whole process or something.
Right.
But then it kind of dawned on me last time too that we talked about Diablo quite a bit, and Baal is one of the Lords of Hell in that franchise as well, and right. Sort of the crossovers, there of it's so funny. So it's like you can go over there and kill Baal too. So
yeah, it's a interesting. It's a different spelling of Baal because Baal.
It's like a BHA or something.
Yeah, it's BHAAL in Baldur's Gate, but in the sort of Christian demonic, whatever tradition, would be just the BAAL. That's what Diablo takes it from, of course. So
right, yeah.
But yeah, anyway,
right, yeah. Well, Baldur's Gate, our final episode. Well,
sort of final.
Maybe not final.
Our continuing to straggle series. Now we had pushed the takeaways from last week because we wanted to get to a little bit of the email and then split some of the email into this week. So the bulk of this episode will be catching up on the mailbag. But first we have to talk about our takeaways. Of course, we're at the end of a series, and so we always like to look back and think about what our reflections are of things that we take away, or even sometimes negative takeaways from a series. Things that might influence our own work going forward. Mm-hmm. So, as I always do, sir, I will let you have first crack.
So kind. Yes, and speaking of good and bad, this first one that I have actually is both, really. And the way that I put it down, at least, which is a little bit overly dramatic, but I wrote down converting an icon, meaning, converting Dungeons and Dragons, which obviously there were games that have come before that were attempting to emulate the rule set, as accurately as possible. But I really think Baldur's Gate was kind of the first one to go really hard on that, and I guess more fully realize it, or at least attempt to. But I think that the thing that we talked about, obviously through the series, is that there definitely were good things about that, especially from a fan and a player's perspective, right? Because it really, what THAC0 is. It feels right. It feels like you're playing a tabletop version, a computer version of a tabletop. But then on the flip side of that, from a takeaway perspective, it seemed like it might have been a be careful what you wish for as well, meaning, converting second edition specifically into a computer game didn't always make for the best, most usable version of a CRPG there could be, because their goal, as we know, was to slavishly focus on making sure that it was accurate, and so that comes with a lot of, we talked even just the simple example of like how big the manual was, like the manual being a mini player's handbook. And it's like, that's a telling sign, I think, right? That there's so many rules that they're trying to smash in there, whether they really need it or not. And so kind of it came with pros and cons, but at the end of the day, it felt like a D&D game. And I think converting it into a CRPG was obviously successful, and I still love it for that. But not all the rules translate, and you could see that there's times, which it'll segue to one of my other takeaways about the combat system, but you could see that there's times when being, holding to those rule sets so rigidly, could make the game, not shine as much as it could have if they had made like just kind of raw game design decisions. video game design decisions.
Right. I had that as well. I just put D&D implementation plus and minus. I think it is. It comes with some definite pluses, certainly as a marketing tactic. I mean, I remember that being a big deal of how full an implementation was going to be. So I think that actually really helped them move units, which of course made it also make such a mark, which is very much to its credit. But I think there are a number of things that distance it from a tabletop, that we talked about through the series that also come up a lot, such as you're controlling 6 characters or up to 6 characters. Your primary character, I guess you could build the whole party. Is that true? But at least the main character.
You can make the whole, I think you can, because you can import, right? You can import.
That's right. Yeah. You can import characters.
I think for everybody. Yeah.
So, that kind of works against them being able to tell their D&D story as well, right? Of course, they're able to tell some stories in it if you use the pre-made characters, but then the story about the main character has to be the sort of primary, the one character you have to roll, is sort of hampered by that, right? I mean, he can only
has
be
to work for
ward, right? Has to work for literally any possible thing, right? And so it's just some of those things are just weird things that don't match up with a tabletop experience, that to me make it feel weird as an implementation of a tabletop experience. Not necessarily bad, and of course not certainly either new, right? Those problems plagued all the SSI games, etc. So it's not, none of these are sort of new problems. It's without making it a full multiplayer experience with the DM, which is to say tabletop itself, it's kind of hard to do those things. So anyway, I would agree with the plus and minus there for sure.
Yeah, that's a good point about sort of the way the story is impacted by what they were trying to attempt here. To your point, like, and I think it's good we're playing D&D right now because we can actually compare quite quickly back and forth, even though it's a different rule set, a different edition. But yeah, I mean, like obviously to some degree, every campaign or every adventure has to be workable for any class makeup, right? And any player makeup, but the DM just has so much more flexibility on adapting that for who you have, and here your DM is just the program and
right.
And
they accommodate placement.
Yeah. They accommodated as much as they could for, like, again, innovating in things that BioWare became, famous for, innovating in dialogue trees and and choices and playing good or evil and stuff, but you can only do so much of that, which I think they keep dabbling in with all of their games up till today. So they definitely kept that theme going, but there's a limit to what you can do there. And I think because it was D&D, there's a certain expectation versus say like a Dragon Age or a Mass Effect, right? That's not based on a tabletop, so it's like the expectations are different, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that, and I think that there are other RPGs, even something like Jade Empire. They all feel, they feel like they can take the things that they did well and sort of new here, and really pay off on them to a greater degree because they are not held back by the system that they chose, right? But they're making whatever system makes sense for what they want to do. You can have more progression. You can do a lot of things that make more sense in a video game than they do on a tabletop. So anyway, it's definitely an interesting choice. It was certainly still, and maybe coming to be the end of the era where it was the huge licensing opportunity that it had, that it was, and these few games are kind of the last hurrah of big D&D games. That really, I guess, ends with Dark Alliance. I can't think of others that have been in the intervening years until kind of just recently that have been anywhere near as big. And that's with Baldur's Gate 3. So,
Yeah. I mean, they did have the Neverwinter Nights games.
That's true. Neverwinter,
which were kind of middle era there. But I mean, that was the big. I mean, really, because BioWare was such the leader in this realm, and to some degree, to a different degree, I guess, Black Isle. Once EA bought BioWare, that's kind of when the strategy heavily changed, or it was before that because Mass Effect was before the purchase. But that they very much wanted to get out. It felt like, and I think they even publicly said they wanted to get out from underneath licensed deals, right? So they wanted to create their own IPs, which is what Mass Effect and Dragon Age became, and so that was actually intentionally a strategy change, which makes sense. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, you got a second one.
Yeah, it's definitely a partner to the first in a different from a different vector, and I just kind of put down a true full campaign as a way to kind of macro describe it, and meaning sort of, obviously we've talked a lot about there's lots to do, and the world is big, and the world is sort of feels like fully realized. Like you feel like you're on the Sword Coast, you feel like you're visiting, Cloakwood and obviously Baldur's Gate and Candlekeep, and these names that are for fans very infamous, but then also like just wandering. And obviously I didn't do it this time as much as you did, but I had done it in the past. And the map is the world map is huge, and there's just so many zones. It's almost like an MMO, right? It's like that feels like you're adventuring and exploring and going from zone to zone. And each zone, I just forgot how big even the zones are. You come onto a new zone, wilderness zone, and you open the map screen for that zone, and you see, you're like, holy cow, this is enormous. A lot of them at least. And it just felt like, and I say that this one is a takeaway for me. I say that as somebody who played the Beeline version, where I really just played the story, and I hadn't played that way before. So I felt like the opposite, right? I felt like I did miss out on, like, I felt like I was a bad adventurer, like I was, like I did a bad job at being a D&D adventurer, because I was like just walking through Cloakwood to get to the, I was like, I bet you I got to go this way. And like, just literally walking by things, and I know from the past and from what you were saying in your playthrough that it's like it's just full and rich and so many, and again, like we talked about the side stories, the secondary quests being even better than the primary one, so that sense of adventure is like something I love about D&D in general, and to nail that and to have these memorable secondary characters and these memorable moments that happen is, I think, a feat for sure.
Yeah, your DM definitely was railroading you on your
right. Yeah. Closing doors for me rather than opening them. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for me, the sort of closest takeaway I have to that is that the sense of exploration specifically. Just the sense that every map had so much stuff. And I also want to point out the mechanical support of making it that you have to go to like each edge of each map to see where you can get to now on the bigger map, on the world.
Yeah,
map,
right.
Which is a really great mechanical. Yeah, and the Fog of War as well within the individual zones. All of that really contributes to a sense of pushing forward and uncovering things on multiple scales, right? The Fog of War is certainly in your local area, but then, pushing out to the world map, you've got, I have to go to try each edge. It can be a little difficult to manage. And I'd almost like to see I'm sure this got better with time. I don't remember if Baldur's Gate works exactly the same. It's probably very similar. I would love to see getting a little more visibility into things as you go, right? Because it's like, instead of having to go off of every edge or something like that, you can sort of get an opportunity to see, okay, there's a few things you can do from here. But with that, minor quibble, I really do think the sense of just about anything could happen, it feels like, is really well supported by the map direction, the map creative direction, I guess, mechanical direction, is just fantastic. And
Well,
there's so much. There's so much. I mean, and there was even things we didn't do. I mean, I didn't do, and I did an awful lot. So
yeah. Well, and I just like this. I feel like my vague memory from playing it lot, when it had just come out, or even just a few years after, and then talking to friends, whether it's at work or what have you. Obviously, we're all playing it, or talking to you later when you played it. The stories I feel like that people tell about the game, the water cooler stories, as we talk about a lot, tend to be about the side content more than the primary content, right? Like that the memorable moments. I mean, maybe like some of the final battles and stuff, and like the doppelganger stuff is memorable. I can think of those sorts of stories, but really it's Cloakwood, some of the side quests in Cloakwood, or Durlag's Tower or what have you,
right.
Those sorts of like kind of infamous ones. And
I do think the story basically picks up once you go to the mines and you get to flood the mines. That's kind of a cool.
That's
idea,
true,
right?
Yeah,
And I think that's where the story just kind of takes off, and everything up to that is kind of like, well, there's this other mine. I mean, that's another thing. Is like this other mine that all the iron's all soft and weird, and it's like, okay, that's strange, and you're kind of reading all the motivations behind it, and you're like, this is just not exciting. But then you get to actually flood a mine to like, mess with their plans, and then go, because you don't know who the Iron Throne is either, right? I thought it literally meant a throne, right? There's a bit of misdirection there, right? It's like, oh, there's some, false king or whatever. It's very evocative. And then you go and it's like, oh no, it's just this group of merchants. And you're like, huh, okay. It's this very weird story. But yeah, I do think, I think the side content comes up from all that exploration, and it's like coming across a thing and having something surprising happen. I think when you talk about The Witcher 3, that's one of the things that The Witcher 3 is really strong about, is taking all these tropes and turning them on their head. And there's lots of bits of that here as well that happens through the exploration. You come across a guy and whatever. So it's pretty good stuff.
Yeah.
So
so I guess for my third and final one, really, I basically put down hybrid tactical combat, and it's definitely a lot more of a mundane description of it, or overly academic description. But the reason I put that one down to kind of on the mechanics side and system side versus sort of the D&D side, though it relates, of course, is the obvious direction for these games up to this point most of the time is turn-based combat, like traditional turn-based. And we even, in our Fallout series, which was 40 years ago, we talked a lot about that. And Fallout, of this era, Fallout was probably one of the better examples of that kind of tactical turn-based combat, pretty well designed, and I think a lot of them were emulating that. But with the Infinity Engine games, it was this weird sort of, I think weird, but also interesting hybrid where you can pause anytime with the space bar, and you can still you can turn off party AI and still feel like you're being tactical. But then there are times when, if you just want to kind of, maybe you're over leveled, or you feel pretty confident about the fight, you can kind of just turn on party AI and not pause and just like see all of the sausage being made, and it's just like, let it go. And that, I just thought that was an interesting, to be honest, I think and I remember this at the time when the game came out too, pretty bold, direction to go from a design perspective, because you are up to, going back to my first takeaway, you are trying to emulate a turn-based combat system. And so how do you find this kind of split the difference on that, so it feels actiony at times, but also when, if you're playing, you get a difficult fight, like we talked about for some of the ending fights, or if you're playing on hard or something, how do you find a system that can actually do both? And I think from a takeaways perspective for me, definitely pros and cons. It definitely doesn't always, it's not as surgical as a turn-based system would be, like Temple of Elemental Evil or the Larian games or what have you. But I think for the most part it works, and that's a feat. Like that's another feat. That's another like wow, you took a risk to do that. And then not only did it work in this game, but Baldur's Gate 2, Icewind Dale. I think even though Neverwinter is a 3D game, the engine moves to 3D. I think they kept the same systems as I remember. You have Torment, which we played. So it's like they just kept moving. It's not like they abandoned it. And so I just think it's a pretty bold move to go in this pretty unorthodox direction with combat.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't put it down as a takeaway, but it is something we talked about quite a lot in the first or second episode. The mixed turn-based combat. I do really like the way that you can go in with a strategy. You can sort of set characters on their targets and what they're doing. You've got your distance. Your bows and your crossbows, whatever, darts if you have darts, slings.
I think they call it ranged.
Yeah, I was going to say you've got your ranged characters of all these different types, but then you're like, you've got your upfronters, and you still like have to hand manage spellcasters, assuming you're not playing with the party AI. So you're kind of timing those things and like trying to figure out when you can put in an instruction into their queue, like, okay, do this next, once they've done a thing. And you can even do that to some degree in real time if you're sort of very on the spot with it, or if you don't have lots of choices that you need to make, like you said, in maybe not a tough fight. But I love that feeling, and it gives us sort of frenetic, constantly on the go feeling, which is really, really nice. And it's a hard thing to replicate at the tabletop because so often people are considering a lot of options when it comes to be their turn instead of being like ready to go, right? And so it's one thing that both feels a little tabletop-y in the sense that you've got all these characters. It's sort of the best way tabletop could work, is right. It's all happening in one person, but it on the screen looks like, oh, here's these 6 separately controlled characters working at pace, right? Which is really nice. And even though you can slow it down and pause it to make it more explicit. That works really well. So I would totally agree with that.
Yeah, and it's also, I remember really quick, and then I'll shut up about it. But I also remember when it came out and kind of seeing the messaging and seeing the marketing, and then maybe playing a demo or something that I was really skeptical. I was like, you can pause, but it's like also real time if you want it to be. Like I didn't understand. I was very as a D&D player and as a gamer, of CRPGs and stuff, I was just skeptical. And so I think that's another, to say that they did pull it off, was a surprise to me. So anyway, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, not at all. Not at all. I was just going to move on to my next one anyway. My final one would be the sort of huge variety of character choice and payoff. A lot of that comes from the system, right? But a lot of it also comes in terms of the party, the companions you pick, because there's a very wide variety of them. There can be fighting in between them if they're not somewhat closely aligned, using the alignment system.
Yeah,
they'll actually argue with each other and things like that. But it does mean that you could play this game as a group of evil characters. You could play this game as a group of neutral characters, etc. I presume if you play as a evil character, the idea is you're going to go and you're out there to kill this guy because you want to be Baal. You want to be the new god of murder, because that's your goal, rather than preventing it, which is all just really interesting. I don't know what the neutral choice is there. This doesn't feel like there's a neutral way, the third way, but maybe I'm not thinking of it. It's just less murder. There's good, there's less murder, and there's evil. But anyway, I mean, I really love that. We actually have an email. Somebody points out that some of the characters that we played, that we mentioned, were new to this edition, the expanded edition. which I didn't realize at the time. I was quite surprised that they were added by Beamdog. So we'll talk about that in the feedback. But so there are more of them than there were in the original game.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
There were still quite a lot in the original game.
Yeah.
So,
no, that's a good one. I was close to writing that one down. I was kind of trying to call. So I'm glad you brought it up. But again, we talked about it during the series. They just became known for the supporting cast, right? And
yes.
Loyalty quests and all that kind of stuff, right? And I think they really changed the role-playing game industry because of it, at least for computer games or for video games, because that emphasis on secondary characters became so important to, I think, the quality of games and writing and wanting your cast to be more interesting than just a bunch of other classes that help you win the game, right. And so I think, I just couldn't, I had a suspicion that some were new for sure, but as I was surprised at the total number, but even in the base game, it was still impressive to see how many there were. So yeah, that's a good one.
I mean, you get to have a number of different high caliber, high quality characters, that you can play with that are quite varied. And it, you can make parties that remind you of any of your favorite high fantasy books of the time, whether that's, I don't know, Dragonlance or so the Belgariad or something like that from David Eddings. I think that's the 80s. So was Dragonlance, I guess. But I was in New Hampshire, and not all this stuff got to me as quickly. But you got a chance though, like, to experiment and have lots of different sort of interactions between the party members, which was not as true of something like an SSI game. They really just didn't have the bandwidth. They could put it in the books if they wanted to, but they really didn't. You sort of, in those games, you really, I think, were almost more encouraged to go ahead and make your own whole party. Yeah. Because they really were just filling in slots, right? So
it was more mechanical.
Much more mechanical. So, and here the characters are truly characters. And of course, voice adds a lot to that as well. Even though not every line is voiced, all the companion characters have some amount of voice, and you hear them, and that imparts some more character and all of that as well. And I think that also helps support it. And is partly why it was on 5 CDs or whatever it was at the time.
Right. So. Well, there's also voice. I think they do a great job. I mean, BioWare became known, obviously, and has always been, really writer focused as a development studio. And there's regardless of voiceover, there's voice in the writing for the characters too, so it's like even without VO, you get a sense of who each of those characters are, and I think the writing does a good job at bringing them out, with or without the voice. But yeah, the voice helps as well. I mean, down the road, like the games are fully voiced, which is, they were the ones that led the charge on what if you were to fully voice a CRPG, which is like mind boggling. But they get there.
They sure do. So those are, unless you have any other minor takeaways you want to mention here.
No, that's it.
That's it. Okay, then that's the last of our mainline discussion. We'll continue our discussion through the feedback here. I'm really glad that we played this one. I know at some point we were like, I don't know if we'll ever play that. That's a 1,000,000-hour game. And we kind of dug in, and I bit off the 1,000,000 hours, and you tried to whittle it down to a small number, and we both made
achieved
our way
it. Right.
So it was it's definitely worth visiting again. I'm glad I did, especially while we've been playing as much D&D as we have been. So a good time to play again.
Yep, I'm glad we did it. Yep.
Okay, well, let's turn the page then to feedback. We've got lots of email having to do with the game, with Baldur's Gate. We'll just go back and forth. These are all to devgameclub@gmail.com. Of course, we also love to get your reviews. I like to say that every single time. So go ahead and throw them our way in the Apple Podcast app or in the podcatcher of your choice. Just shoot us an email if we don't read it on the air after some amount of time, because maybe we missed it somehow or just didn't catch it in whatever format you use. But, sir, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, we have subject is Baldur's Gate and role-playing games, a question from Dan Hunter. Hello, Dan. Brett and Tim. Hi, guys. Hope you're well. I've just installed Baldur's Gate from DVD. Okay. Uh-oh. I had the joyful experience that the digital downloads don't offer. A trailer for Descent 3 coming in 1999 that played after the game installed. Wow. Yeah. I have fond memories of Interplay, including trailers with a number of their disc installations. Descent 3 looks and sounds awesome. This is so weird. I'm looking forward to giving BG a second glance, as I bounced off it some 20 years ago, but I feel it might be more up my alley as I've recently been playing Divinity Original Sin with a friend. Hey, me too. As long as there's a magic missile, I'll be okay. Yeah, I don't know if there isn't exactly that, but the topic of genre often comes up in conversations with my students. Some genres, such as the first-person shooters, or as we used to call them, Doom clones, are easy to categorize. However, when it comes down to role-playing games, what attributes and mechanics must be present for a game to be identified as an RPG? If you have to play as a character, then is Pac-Man a role-playing game? If the game has experience points, do the latest iterations of FIFA and Tomb Raider fit the bill? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what makes a CRPG, and if you can call a judgment on a discussion, not an argument, honest, I'm having with one of my students. Hi, Liam, if you're listening. Hello, Liam. Is Dark Souls a role-playing game? Oh, boy. Final question. In your experience, how important is genre when designing a game? If so, in what context? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Stay safe, Dan Hunter, Guernsey.
Yes. So that's a big question.
The age-old question.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I think that so many games have what we call role-playing elements or progression elements more commonly, I guess we say these days, in them nowadays, that it's kind of interesting to think about this question. I think for me, what tends to make the distinction between those games and a role-playing game is closing off options as much as you're opening up options for yourself as you progress, right? I mean, I don't think of, any of the Ubisoft games, which again, I love. I've played all the mainline Assassin's Creed games up to Odyssey. I don't think of them as role-playing games because I'm going to have all the progression stuff. I'm going to get it all. It's all going to happen to me.
Yeah, right.
And I think theoretically that's possible with Skyrim, but it would take a ridiculous amount of time in order to do it. It's not really, very few players will achieve that. Whereas I think in the Ubisoft games, people generally will, right? If they play the whole game, they'll get most of it, if not all of it. And the games are kind of built around that. That's the progression is there as a reward, less than a sort of means of distinguishing between characters or between builds or between your approaches to your play. So in some sense, those decisions are less meaningful from a mechanical standpoint, because at some point you're just going to wash them all out, and they'll be meaningful because you'll use the ones you like more. So it'll still be meaningful to you. You will still probably have a character build, but all of them will probably be open to you. And that doesn't feel like a role-playing game to me. So that's one thing I think of these days, is that progression mechanics often are lots and lots of checkboxes, right? Those are checkbox games. I love them for it, but there are games where you check off a million different boxes on a million different tracks. I don't know. What about you? Do you have any other sort of things that you think about?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I was joking earlier saying this is a big topic and age old topic. Cause I mean, in my world, it comes up day to day, as a debate, especially amongst game designers who love to talk about this stuff all day long. So usually I'm shutting it down and saying, let's not talk about this again. Yeah. but yeah, I mean, I think Brett put it really well on the sort of like closing off options. I think that's a really interesting way to approach the question. The other way I'll approach it is like to Brett's point, like we make a strong distinction these days, I feel like, where we say something can have RPG elements, and in a game, like any genre now, which is good, I think, can have RPG elements, but it doesn't make it an RPG game, or a role-playing game. And so for me, my distinction tends to be that role-playing games, video game versions of role-playing games tend to be sort of a holistic design, meaning that for it to cross over that line from having RPG elements, which to Brett's point could be progression, could be, quests, could be leveling up, like even Arkham, like the Batman games, you get experience points for punching a dude in the face, and
right.
And it's like, that's weird, but it works, right? It gives you some goals and some sense of like, I'm achieving something. That's fine, but it's not an RPG to me. And again, this is highly debatable, and I don't know, Dan, if you're ever really going to fully conclude on your argument with Liam, but for me, it's holistic. So for instance, like I think RPGs do need these RPG elements like progression, in the various forms, like goals that the player's going out, like a quest or a mission, whatever you want to call it, that they're making choices on. But I think one of the other elements for me is that you're inhabiting a character that has, not a predetermined sort of arc, that you are actually impacting quite heavily. And that's kind of an overwrought description of what I'm trying to say. But, so, it's like this is probably blasphemy, but I wouldn't call Witcher 3 an RPG, in my definition. I think it has a lot of RPG elements, and it gets very close to it, but that game is about Geralt, and about everything that he's going through, and he levels up, and you have crafting a little bit, and and you get some essentially equivalent of spells, and you don't really pick a class, and so I think what I mean by inhabiting a character is classes specifically, as the example from D&D. It's like playing as something that's very different from, you have a choice to play different versions of the main character, and it doesn't have to be the D&D traditional class system, but something like that, archetypes of some kind. I think that's an important element, and that's where the Dark Souls for me gets muddy, because you can play as different archetypes in that game. It's largely based on the weapons you use, though. So
there are stats. There are stats too, though. So
yeah, there are stats, but I mean, you get those stats up a lot by like how you play, isn't that right? I mean, but I mean,
but I think it does close up. I think it's not like you're going to get them all to 100 or something like that, right? There comes a point where it's diminishing returns. It becomes so slow that it's not a way you can play. It might actually had a cap. I can't remember. I played.
Yeah, no, you're not gonna. It's not a completionist game in that way. No.
Right.
You're picking a build.
Yeah, the other part I would say is I'm picking out these elements that I'm kind of talking about and the closing off of options, but I also think it's a spectrum, right? I don't think that there's a like, oh, you cross this line, now you're an RPG. I think it's more like, if you there's a philosophy thought experiment about, if you take, a person, so you take me and then you take somebody who's very much not me, I don't know, Betty Davis or something like that, and you can imagine, genetic mixes between me and Betty Davis where you're on the spectrum. At some point you're 50-50, and it's like, well, which one are you then? And how, at what point do you say this is Brett versus this is, Betty? It's
yeah.
It's not all or nothing, it's a continuum. And I think that's why the discussion's often not helpful, and why you're like, let's not go down this road again, because in some ways we are like a role-playing game. In some ways it's much more interesting, I think, to talk about what are we trying to make the player feel when we use the specific mechanics that we employ. And less about, where is this going to fit on the shelf at GameStop.
However, though, the trick which he also asked us in his tricky email, where he asked us like 5 questions sneakily.
He's a rogue.
Yeah, exactly. The trick, though, rubber meets the road trick, it does actually come down to marketing and genre, because there is a point when, I completely agree with you when it comes to like, it's a diminishing returns debate, because role playing, like I'm definitely tired of this debate personally and like professionally, because it does come up so much. And at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. And I don't think my silver lining to all this, which we always talk about on my teams, is like, we should be thankful that RPG elements are bleeding into every genre, because it makes so many of those genres better, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. But you don't have to debate the details of like whether that changes the game. It's just like you were just saying, Brett. It's like, is the game better for it or not? Like, what do we want them to feel? The one caveat, though, is the frustrating conversations I've had with people, with other people in sort of other areas, whether that be marketing or executives or something like that, where they want to classify the game because they need to sell it, and there are times when Dragon Age needs to be billed as an RPG, because that's why people want to play it. Right. Does The Witcher need to be? It's like certain groups will want it to be, but it's certain other groups will actually, they'll push the game away because they think it's an RPG, right? And that's actually kind of the weird thing about that particular game. It blew up, right? And huge game over many years. And there's people that, there's action adventure players who play that game and don't think twice about the RPG elements, because they kind of like, I don't even know how planned it was, to be honest, but they kind of like threaded the needle on that. So it kind of felt like both. So it kind of fulfilled both. But yeah, and I think that's where Dark Souls.
I think setting goes a long way with that as well. It's like there are games that Dark Souls, I think, is one of them, because the setting feels like a fantasy game. It sort of already feels a little bit like a role-playing game just because it's set in this fantasy setting, right, with swords and warhammers and what have you, right? And I think that that's kind of a genre game genre versus sort of fiction genre bleed. They've been so closely held together for so many years because it started with Dungeons and Dragons and was that for a long time, even though there were always niche games that were not that were horror or science fiction or whatever. The main line of what the mass public would think of as, would think of D&D and fantasy as being the same thing. Right, that it's just one.
Yeah, no, right? for sure. Yeah, but what about is Bloodborne an RPG then? So for before. Yeah. Anyway, this is a deep hole that I think is not that useful as we said, but I wanted to ask you a question / Dan a question. To confirm, who do you think is on which side of that argument? And for, I guess, to answer his question on Dark Souls, for me specifically, I personally think it doesn't matter in that case, because Dark Souls is Dark Souls to some degree. It's like it's become its own kind of genre, but the setting definitely impacts it for sure. But I'm curious. I'm just kind of like wondering, because I have a theory on who's on which side, but it's a funny example for sure, and I don't know if actually the developers have ever even said what they think it is.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, I mean, another one I think of that way is Dragon's Dogma, which I think is yeah, I think is a role-playing game, but doesn't have a lot of things you'd think of as a role-playing game. And of course, you can switch your classes basically at any time. So it's like, and it's also not even, and you can't be all of them at once. It's not like a Ubisoft game or something like that where you're just going to get all the powers. You do have to be one thing at one time, or two things maybe, I guess. And there's a bunch of classes. I don't know. It's an interesting offshoot. And JRPGs are the same way, where it's like, oh, okay, well, there's not a lot of choices for this. The story is the story, right? We've talked about that too, and long time ago. So I'm not gonna dive back into that, but it does open up these questions a lot, which is funny because they started from the same place. Final Fantasy, the original, was very much a D&D inspired game. So,
right.
Anyway,
right. Yep. Good one.
That's a good set of questions from our rogue. The subject of our second one here is Baldur's Gate companion pairs from Warren Linham Church. He says, as you discussed a bit in episode 2 of the Baldur's Gate series, the game has a mechanic where some companions only come as pairs. This is definitely not how future BioWare games worked. Baldur's Gate 2 kills off Dynaheir and Khalid off screen before the game begins, so Minsk and Jaheira are quote-unquote free from that mechanic. It also seems like most companion-centric games don't do that either. Why do you think BioWare didn't continue with that mechanic? How could a game use something like companion pairs to give interesting choices to the player? Warren Linham Church. What are your thoughts on that, sir? Do you have any?
It's a interesting detail because I didn't know if I couldn't remember if they had continued that into Baldur's Gate 2 or not. I don't know. I mean, I guess I assume that they just felt like it was too limiting to some degree. There's two potential disadvantages. One is it locks them into trying to make sure that the audience likes both of the pair enough to keep both of the pair. And so put some constraints on, I think, maybe what the writers can do and what the developers can do with the pair. I think it is more interesting, though, to have couples or pairs or what have you. I liked it. However, I didn't like Khalid, and I did want him to go away. But I didn't want him to go away because I knew I would lose Jaheira, and so and I didn't keep Minsk with me because I went and did that quest, so I let them both go. I can see the simplicity of the decision that they made because, it makes their life a little easier, and it also gives players more flexibility if they don't like one or the other characters. But the designer in me is like, it does sound more interesting to actually try to crack that nut and to keep doing it. I don't know. Obviously,
I
don't
think
know exactly why.
that is the real risk, is that players will like one or the other, or even designers might be tempted to be like, oh, well, let me give you this really strong character, but you have to take this weaker character to go with it, to like balance out characters between one another as well. But I do think it makes for more interesting storytelling when the characters know each other. That's one of the things that takes a while to gel in any tabletop game. Is like, how do these characters relate? And because so many role playing campaigns start in a tavern, right, where you all just happen to be there, and then something happens, and now you're all together. And it takes a while for that to gel. Sometimes it happens quicker than others, but in general, it is a weird thing. One of the game I'm playing in with you, two of the characters know each other. They're sisters, adopted sisters, and that makes a huge, that made a huge kind of difference in the tenor of that right off the bat. And in a way, the other two characters, which is me and the barbarian, have sort of become adopted brothers in a way. In how we approach things as well. So it led to this very natural and interesting dynamic that was reflected by the fact of these other character things. So I don't know. I think that it's a lot richer to allow for that possibility. But I do think there's a lot of weird traps to try to have to avoid there, which also makes it feel sort of weirdly constrained. So I don't know. It's a tough one. I think by and large this game does it perfectly fine. It didn't really bother me, and there were times where Cal would be like, "Oh, my wife's going to kill me," and I'd be like, "Oh, that's right, that's his wife." And it's, I think they could have leaned into it a little bit more, actually, to make it pay off. And if they had, it might have meant for that had more of an impact moving forward. I think if they had been willing to lean into it further, they might have seen a little bit more of, sort of player involvement in that. The other thing too, though, is I think that when you're inviting couples in, then your companions don't become romance options anymore. And I think that that's actually been such a big part of modern BioWare, more recent BioWare games, that you bring in all these characters and their potential romance targets for the PC. So I think that that's actually been a change as well. And if they're already partnered up, that's unlikely to be in this day and age. I think it's where the audience is not open-minded enough for the most part to accept something a little bit broader in that regard. So so you're kind of closing off those romance options that people love so much in BioWare games. So, and that basically centers the whole world around the player, which to me, I do think is less interesting, honestly. When everything's always about the player, I worry about the capacity of games to tell more interesting stories. So, not that they can't, but it's just, it closes off certain things. So those are my thoughts for sure. All right, let's move on to the third email, which I guess for you is the second email.
Yeah, exactly. Listener comment, Baldur's Gate from Greg. I wanted to write in and say I really enjoyed listening to your adventures in Baldur's Gate. I have attempted to play a few times myself. However, I would always quit in frustration after failing to beat simple encounters early on at easier difficulties. I thought that I just sucked at the game, and it was too complicated for me. THAC0 doesn't help. After hearing you two talk about how volatile rolls can be at low levels, and that both of you have had to reload several times to beat the same encounters, it started to all make sense to me. That's just part of the game. With this knowledge, I have started playing again with a different mindset, and have really enjoyed my experiences, as the game no longer feels too hard or complicated, and now I am nearing the end of the story. Thank you, Greg. Oh, Greg, I think might have come on the stream. He might have been the Durlag's Tower fellow who...
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Hello, Greg. Yeah. It sounds like him. It sounds like him. He definitely, he had some strong thoughts about Durlag's Tower specifically, but otherwise it sounds like he got over a hump, which is great. Yeah. And embracing saves and embracing failure, and which again is not really a tabletop thing, right? Like it's not really seen that way, the sort of save scumming sort of side of it. And it's not really fair to even call it save scumming, because I think it is just a game is balanced around it. So that's interesting that you got over that hump, Greg, and I'm glad you did.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad that we talked about it in those terms, because it would have been easy to just kind of ignore that. Because I think actually that's part of it. Might not have been a thing we talked about at the time when it came out. We might have just accepted that as, oh yeah, that's just how these games are, right?
Yeah,
and just not even talked about that issue. But looking at it now, 20 something years on, we can look at that and say, oh yeah, this game really relies on that, which is not as much a thing anymore.
Right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say there's a problem solving to it, right? Because it's almost like, I think we talked about it during the series. There's sort of a puzzly nature, right? You come into a counter that totally takes you down and you're like, oh shoot, I just did that all wrong. Let me try again, and you're like, okay, let me approach it this way. You talked about that a lot, right? Especially in the final ones. And that kind of does become part of the game. It's like, how am I going to solve this combat puzzle? Luckily I get to try it multiple ways and just kind of having fun actually doing that, rather than feeling like you're being punished, because you do have so many options in the game, because you have all the different characters.
Right. Yeah. And their huge spell books are all their, in my case, having a frontline rogue who could go and do a bunch of different sorts of things as well. Yeah. You get a lot of variety and a lot of, I mean, there's just so many different things you can try. and some of the more difficult content, I had to try a lot of different things, and sometimes just try the same thing over and over again until I get the numbers right. Which was specifically like, okay, I can't think of anything else. I'm just going to brute force this until the random number gods, bless me. So yeah, I was going to say, Assassin's Creed, I mentioned that earlier, is a game that saves all the time, but I never save scum. It's pretty rare that I die, relatively speaking, right? Whereas, Baldur's Gate is all the time. It's just all the time. And, it's funny because I normally really hate replaying things. But one of the things I think that happens with Baldur's Gate is that if you lean into saving frequently, you're actually not often replaying things. Right. You're attempting the same battle multiple times, but you actually haven't finished it yet. So you can't really even be saying you're replaying it. You're just trying it again. Right. So it's also that it's like, it's not as frustrating to save and reload when how this thing plays out the next time is actually going to be different. So you're not playing the same thing in some sense again and again, which I think is also an interesting distinction. So. Yeah, a lot there for sure. I guess it's my turn. I have one here from Logan. Subject is Core Mechanics meets Level Design, which is good. I'm reading it so that you can think about it as I read it, because that means it'll be you. Hi, Brett and Tim. I was wondering if you could spend some time talking about the interplay. Oh, I see what you did there. Logan, nice work. The interplay between designing core mechanics and designing levels or moment-to-moment gameplay. At what point during the design process do you start thinking about the levels you want to create? How locked down are the core mechanics by that point? And how do you manage designing levels if the core mechanics are still in flux? Is it common to spend too much time iterating on the basic verbs of the game and not enough on the moment-to-moment experience? My personal theory is this is why the first sequel to a game is often considered better gameplay-wise to the original, even when the mechanics are largely the same. He mentions Assassin's Creed, Borderlands, Mass Effect, Uncharted, etc. The developers were likely crunched just trying to get the core gameplay together and lacked the necessary time to polish the moment-to-moment stuff like level design. That's always just been my theory, though, and I'd love to hear from someone who's actually experienced that process. I can imagine it's very dependent on the size and structure of the design team. Best, Logan. Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, it's big. It's also very different for each project and team, and studio, right? The different studio processes or cultures. But I mean, I think his theories are definitely good and I think spot on as far as like especially his sequel theory. I think that there's the ideal answers that I think we as developers always want to have happen in a certain way, but really the reality is never the ideal. But yeah, you do, early on, you definitely want to spend your concept and sort of pre-pro phase working on the core mechanics and nailing them down in sort of like a gym kind of way, like building a gameplay gym, and metrics are a big part, right? Because you really don't want to start level design too early when you don't have your metrics nailed down, because everything needs to be based on those metrics. But the truth of the matter is, like he was sort of predicting, especially for a new game in a new series, there is a lot of back and forth early on, because if you have level designers already on the team and waiting for the core mechanics to get going, you want them to sort of start experimenting and dabbling, right? The thing that people need to, that probably people know, and it's like, not, especially our listeners are pretty savvy with kind of reading on game development a lot. A lot of the level design work early in a project just gets thrown away, to be honest. Like in fact, the best ones,
the levels get built in the last 9 months.
yeah, exactly. And what I was going to say is the best developers and the best, I think games, do throw away the early content, because, I think there's always that sunk cost fallacy problem where you've spent this time on these levels while the mechanics and the systems were being built, and then you're like, I spent so much time on this, I don't want to throw it away, but we changed the height of the jump, So we got to throw it away. We got to start, it's easier to throw it away than to retrofit it or something. But then sometimes you let that get the better of you and you try to keep a level around. And at the end of the day, it ends up being much better, to just start from scratch when you have those. But to be, it's not an exact science, to be honest. And I'm kind of explaining the ideal. A lot of times you are kind of back and forth. And the other thing I'll say that I think I've said before, level designers can really help influence the core mechanics, right? Because they're the ones that need to merge with it to really make it shine. And there really shouldn't be seen as separate entities in a assembly line waiting for one to finish the other. You really want, and actually that goes with level art as well. You want your level artists to kind of have an understanding of what the gameplay goals are. And then level design can help give feedback. And so you kind of want that kind of healthy tension between them waiting for the core mechanics to get done and kind of tapping their foot a little bit, but also like playing the gym, playing with the gameplay designers and saying like, hey, I'm thinking about the flow of how we're going to actually make this work in a level. And what about this? And so, you make it work, but there is not a one size fits all. But yeah, ideally you get as many of your metrics down before you go whole hog. But to Brett's point, like, the real meaty level design work tends to happen later on. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I was going to say, especially to the sequel point, is that usually, by the time the sequel is happening, people are comfortable and familiar with the tools and they can iterate much more quickly.
Yeah.
And so those second games might even have less development time because they're not building, from the ground up. They already have a lot of stuff working. They're just kind of executing on, a framework that they already have. But they're already more comfortable in that framework, right? So they have a lot easier time just diving in and adding new whatever, new quests, new levels, new et cetera. And because they're already familiar with it, they can also push it because they understand what it can do, and they have some thoughts of experiments they could do to push it further because they've kind of trod the existing ground, and they're like, yeah, but what if I did this, right? And you sort of have that additional aspect of creativity that happens when you're really comfortable with a thing. So there's that too, I think, that happens. I think, I guess I've worked on other sequels, but they weren't sequels to me. So for me, the only real sequel I've ever worked on that was a sequel for me was Jedi Starfighter. And I look at those levels and I think those levels are way more creative in their use of the engine in a lot of ways than the first game. And a lot of it was purely, even though it wasn't the same level design team, there was a lot more comfort with everything being locked down, mechanically speaking, as mentioned, but also just, we know how the tools work and they're finished. They're solid. I mean, they were pretty solid on Starfighter, but they were completely solid and unchanging, basically, for Jedi Starfighter, which is a much shorter development time. So that's another thing I point to and say, sure, but when your team really knows what they're doing with the tools, that makes a huge difference, and that takes a while to get under you. So yeah,
good one. Yeah.
All right, back to you, sir.
Okay, meaningful choices from Keith Wagner. Hi, Brett and Tim. I've been going back and forth between current and older content trying to catch up, and I recently finished your series on GTA 3. One of the things you brought up during episode 3 was about choices having meaning. Specifically, you brought up an example from Baldur's Gate, where it
was actually, now that I think about it, it was Baldur's Gate 2, I believe. So
Okay.
I when I read this email, I was like, yeah, I didn't encounter that this time, and I would have. So I think it might have been the sequel. Anyway, that doesn't change the point. Yeah.
Yep. Baldur's Gate, where you had the option to tell a side quest mother the truth that her son was dead. I feel like I did find this one. Maybe not. Anyway, or lie and say he ran away, or something to that effect. You saved before making the choice, so you could see how they both panned out, and were disappointed when the rewards were identical beyond a bit of flavor text. As I'm now starting in on your current Baldur's Gate series, it's interesting to hear how much choice mattered, at least at the beginning, in terms of potential party formation. You also brought up the difficulties in catching edge cases in scripting. I'm curious, as you play this time, if you think the developers got the balance between number of meaningful choices and complexity of development / QA right. Regards, Keith Mystery Dip Wagner. All right, now I know who Mystery Dip is.
There you go.
Nice.
I thought it's funny that I made this comment. I know I wrote a blog post about this a million years ago, about that particular experience in whatever role-playing game that was, and how I was disappointed. But now I think about it and I'm like, you know what? The real problem in that equation was me. Because I went and tried them both. Yeah. And that just ruins it. It just ruins the magic. And it was almost like I was just going, oh, I wonder if I can pop this balloon. Oh, look, I put the pin in the balloon. I don't have a balloon anymore. Duh. Because I think about experiences over, and this would have been something I would have played, I think, by the time we talked about GTA 3, but something like Firewatch, or certainly like The Walking Dead or something like that. Games that have all these choices that are in some sense not meaningful, in the sense that the main line of the story is not going to change significantly. Like Firewatch is not significantly going to change in the events that happen. Your experience of them definitely is, however, based on the choices you make, right? And when I went and, pulled aside the curtain and revealed the man behind, I kind of took away that experience for me of this is what the story was for me. Yeah. Right? And so the choice became meaningless, but it was meaningful up until the point that I pulled aside that curtain. And I chose to take that away from myself for some reason. I mean, I guess at the time I was just like, I wonder what happens. I'm sure it was not, I don't think it was malicious when I did it. I think it was more just I think, and now that I think about it, now that I'm talking, it's kind of bringing it back. It's like, oh yeah, I remember being really stymied. I'm not sure what I should do here. Yeah. And kind of wrestling with it, but not wrestling with it enough to actually come to the conclusion of this is what I actually believe, or this is what this character would believe. Yeah. Right. In that particular case. And so I tried them both. Because I didn't take the time to say, this is what I believe. She would be better off thinking her child is alive, or she would be better off knowing the truth. That's a tough choice to make. And of course, the game's probably not written deeply enough that I could actually feel like the character would care one way or the other. So I'm sure the game didn't help me in that regard. But still, I deprived myself of that meaningful thought process and et cetera by choosing both. That was the problem. I think more than anything else. Anyway.
Well, and not to get too heady, but I think, games like Baldur's Gate were some of or especially in this genre, were some of the games that were trailblazing in actually asking players to think about this stuff. So in a way, it's I feel like, to your point, at the time, and I'll speak for myself, but I think you're probably in a similar camp now. You kind of become more, I don't mean mature in the literal sense, but you become more of a mature player the more of these games you play and the more you kind of embrace those choices. And I know for myself as a player over time, I've become much more I seek out the games that allow me to make these hard decisions and stick with them. You know what I mean? I don't reload anymore. I kind of just let the story become my story, as you said. And I think in the, 20 years ago, I wasn't doing that. I was kind of, and maybe it's an age thing. I don't know. I would like to think that kind of games are challenging, giving gamers more credit these days, right? And allowing them to kind of really embrace those. And then the other thing I was going to say is, the funny thing about that example is and especially with the question, I'm wondering if, I bet you they didn't actually design it this way on purpose or plan for this to be the case. But if the reward for doing both versions was different, if it did end up actually that it felt like one was better than the other, then it actually might have been worse, because
Yeah,
the fact that it was the same actually might have been part of how the formula should work, because they are just they're trying to have you make a story decision, not a decision for, an extrinsic decision, right? They want you to make an intrinsic decision here of like, what kind of character are you? What is your character going to do in this case? Not like, do I get gold versus, I don't know, a new sword or something.
Yeah. Well, we will revisit that part of the question when we play BioShock someday, because that is a big part of the question in that game as well. I think that because and I don't want to really say more than that, because I think people know what I'm getting at already. Yeah. But if you don't, you at some point we will play that, and you get a chance to hear our thoughts on that.
That's going to be a funny, I don't know. There's so much to unpack there in that game. But anyway, I did want to, he had a sub question in there that I didn't want to call out.
Yes. Yep. About complexity of dev and QA. Yeah.
Yeah. In retrospect, I feel like they did a pretty good job, especially for their sort of first attempt at this. The one example that I'll push back on my own point there. So anyway, my general answer is I think the balance was pretty good in my opinion, though Brett did a lot more optional stuff, so he may disagree. But we were talking last episode about the Ambassador Tar or Emissary Tar sort of thing at the end in the Iron Throne. You remember that? Tar?
Yes.
Was her name?
Yeah. Tar. Yep.
And that was an example where I had a plan and a theory that I thought the writing was kind of directing me toward, and then I did that thing and it didn't work. And so I actually did do some save scumming there, like we were just talking about, and I tried a bunch of different versions to see if I could achieve the goal that I wanted to, or the goal that I thought that they were advertising to me. But in that case, the balance of choice and probably complexity of development, basically prevented me from doing that. So, because basically there was only really one way, as far as I could tell, there's only one way to deal with Emissary Tar's involvement in that encounter. Even though it kind of gives you the impression that you can kind of do it in a craftier way. Maybe if I had a character with a higher charisma, there's a new option that I didn't get or something, but I don't know. So I'd be interested to know how that sort of flowchart works for that particular event. But that's sort of the classical, what we're kind of talking about is the classical diamond choice flow, where that's the Walking Dead conundrum as a kind of a really perfect example of that, because there's a lot of ways, basically kind of the core. I don't want to spoil too much. I guess it's older game anyway, but it's just like, there's lots of choices in the middle, but the beginning and the end kind of roughly end the same for everybody. Yeah. So, but anyway,
sure.
Sorry, what were you going to say?
Yeah, no, I don't really feel differently about that. I mean, I think one of the things that they did that was a good choice that actually helped this work was to allow you to have people leave your party and then rejoin you later. So you basically could, if you're like, I'm going to try this other thing, you could, that gave you basically a wider field of options for play. You could kick somebody out of your party to bring somebody in and go, I'm not sure I like that. And then, have them depart and go pick up the person again, which I think is a useful thing as well. So that's another thing where it's like, well, actually you get to revisit some choices if you really don't think they're working out for whatever reason. I don't know if they level the characters independent of you, and if they don't, that kind of makes that unfortunately not work really well. To some extent, it's like, well, yes, I've leveled all these characters up, so I guess I'm sticking with them.
I think they do. Yeah, it feels like, because I feel like I did it at one time somehow, and as soon as I got the character in my party, they dinged. But anyway,
maybe they bring him up to the average or something like that. I don't remember. So that those sorts of things are certainly helpful. It's something we've talked about in other games as well. So in terms of how it lets the player direct that stuff and not punish you for making certain choices. Anyway, I feel like they did a pretty good job on that, especially for this being their first big big RPG for sure. I have one here from Artemage. Subject is Baldur's Gate before D&D. Hello, devs. I'll skip the preamble so we can get to the topic. I am a geeky kid who grew up in rural southern Ontario. As such, I was aware that D&D was a thing, but had no details about it. So my first exposure to the game system of rules was through a buddy who lived down the street when he got Baldur's Gate 2 Shadows of Amn in 2000. Now, my previous gaming experience had me treat it more like an RTS due to its interface, so it took me some effort to get into. Though I stopped playing pretty early on when I eventually came across a copy of the original title at a local EB Games, I moved over to that title but have yet to complete either at this time due to many a save game lost from my brothers being less competent at computers than I and hardware failures. I finally got the chance to play D&D on the tabletop about 3 years after my introduction to Baldur's Gate 2, when my girlfriend at the time found a not spectacular 3rd edition introductory box set. That product told me where to look to really dive into the game, and I bought the Core 3 within a month. I was heavily invested in what was the current edition of the time, 3.5, though I missed some of the nuance of the 2nd edition AD&D rules that were relayed in the Baldur's Gate manuals. This led me to create some modifications that essentially made a lot of it my own system, complete with custom classes and unique abilities. I remained heavily invested in Dungeons & Dragons, even becoming a GM for the RPGA through the life of 3.5, and quit during 4th edition in 2010 due to it straying so far from what I enjoyed about the games and moving to other systems, primarily Shadowrun, in case there's any curiosity. So that's my history of both Baldur's Gate and D&D. I don't know how unique I am as one who came to the tabletop after the digital, but you can at least know that there was one. Regards, Artemage. Yeah, this was in response. We specifically asked if there were people who played this game before. The RTS tie is an interesting one. Of course, that makes total sense to some degree. Like if you had never seen, and real-time strategy games were huge at the time that these games came out. So you could see that happening for sure.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, thanks for the story. That's great. Yeah, I don't think he's alone. I mean, I think that sounds like a really good example of somebody who was, got enough hooks into him where, becoming a GM for the RPGA or something like that's and making up his own homebrew rules for 3.5 or what have you. That's pretty awesome. And that's a big deal. Like that's somebody who definitely the bug, bit them. And I would just know that there's gotta be people where, I think the Baldur's Gate package was presented in such a way where it made D&D feel cool. It felt like something you want to do more of. And imagine playing Baldur's Gate and then thinking, oh wait, there's the tabletop where I can do anything. I don't have the constraints of the computer. And so, which is so funny to say, it's kind of actually a neat statement because so often we think computers can do anything, but no, actually we can do anything.
No, we can do anything. It takes us to make the computers do the things. I did want to touch on the RPGA briefly because I had mentioned a couple, 2-3 episodes ago about playing in a tournament when I was a kid on the tabletop. Yeah. And the RPGA is the kind of modern embodiment of that. It is, I think there are points and things like that even still today, like you can score and things like that, and it's kind of regulated. There's been a lot of different flavors. I've never dipped into it again. And it was only after that episode when I was thinking about it in retrospect going, oh yeah, there's still these sorts of things. I just don't partake, and that's for sure. That's just something I forgot. It was like, well, when I was a kid, these were a thing. And I think I even said in the episode, I don't know if those are a thing anymore, but they are. They've just kind of changed, I think. Yeah. Worth mentioning, they have ongoing storylines, and that's of course they want to get the really involved players, right? Big fans, kind of tied into these things over at Wizards. They want them, they are trying these things out and they're putting out little bits and things, and for them to, kind of advance these storylines. I know with, I guess it was 3.0 or 3.5, the RPGA had like where you lived on planet Earth.
like
told you
leagues.
where you started. Yeah, it told you where you started in planet Oerth in Greyhawk, in the Flyness, I think. I looked that up at one point. I was like, oh, if I started in Maryland, I would have started in such and such. Just
neat.
kind of interesting that they did that, so that geographically, if you went and played with people, you were all in the same region, right? That makes sense, obviously, because it would have been tied to like stores and stuff. Anyway, let's move on to the final email.
Yes, so
we'll be caught up.
Yay! So Beamdog or BioWare, Ashton Herman from Ashton Herman. Hi, Brett and Tim. Last Baldur's Gate email, I swear. Okay, well, it turns out it might actually be. Something I've wanted to bring up before, but was certain that you'd run into it before now, was that the enhanced edition of Baldur's Gate included a number of characters and features that weren't part of the original game. Yeah, we actually should have probably done more research on that. Characters like Dorn and Nira and the monk Rasad were new inclusions written and designed by Beamdog for the re-release, for example, along with all of their side quests. Wow. Nira, I somehow had this weird memory of Nira, but I guess I didn't.
I really struggle with that statement, and I want to do further. I want to actually install the original games. I wonder if some of these characters were in Baldur's Gate 2 and have been backported into Baldur's Gate 1. If that's a possible thing. Because that whole thing with Dorn, I'm like, I'm fairly certain they named him for Michael Dorn. and that's why he was a half-orc. But possibly that was Baldur's Gate 2 and he wasn't in the first one. And he got expanded expanded edition or something. Like, I don't...
Yeah.
But I'm like... Well,
that would make sense, because that's how Beamdog would have taken assets, right, and stuff.
Yeah,
back.
Exactly.
Yeah,
yeah, because I don't know.
So they might have existed, but not in this game.
And not in this game or something like that. Yeah. Rasad, though, does maybe seem like a new character to me, because I was like, I probably would have taken a monk at the time, because I was playing a bard probably. Anyway, Go ahead, continue. Sorry.
Yeah. Or inclusions written and designed by Beam. Okay, yeah. The enhanced edition also includes the characters' class kits that were included in Baldur's Gate 2, as well as updated visual effects that weren't originally present in Baldur's Gate 1 or Icewind Dale 1. Beamdog also added some new weapons to make certain weapon specializations viable in Baldur's Gate 1 that wouldn't otherwise have been. Magic Katana, for example, were either extremely rare or non-present in Baldur's Gate 1's original release. Yeah, I didn't remember those. I got some of those for Rasad. Or one of them. D&D 3.0 sneak attack option Tim brought up in Icewind Dale is another feature added to the enhanced editions of the game. Okay, that makes sense. I think that makes Baldur's Gate a fascinating game because it exists in history as this great BioWare RPG, but it's also a game that continues to receive support today from a new developer in the form of Beamdog, and the ways the games have been changed aren't always apparent to the player. I'm curious how you guys feel about this as developers, especially with the Republic Commando Switch port recently announced. Does it bother you to see your game get picked up by a whole new team? Do you worry about your vision for that game? Do you think it's important players be told more clearly by the game's re-release what's been changed from the original source material? Thanks as always for the great show, Ashton. Thanks, Ashton. Thanks for the info.
Yeah, thank you. That's great info, because I do. We knew we were playing the expanded edition. We did not, as you point out, do any research about what was in the original game, what was not. I think we were just trying to capture the feel of the original game, and I think that the game that we played does that, right? I mean, it does. It may have other things that it has done, but I do think all of our points kind of are fine as far as that goes. As far as matching up with the original game goes just fine. It is funny that a third of my party was new characters. That's funny to me. I certainly remembered Kaladin Jahira. I had thought for sure Nira was in the original game. Rasad definitely felt new. So I don't, and MON of course was in the original game, but Yeah, I don't know. It's just funny. I mean, personally, I don't. It doesn't bother me at all that the Republic Commando will be on a new system. They'll have to work with the controls, but even that stuff, I don't think they'll have to do that much. Like, I don't like. There's not a lot that they're going to have to do. I don't think, honestly. To make it be essentially the same game, right? Update the rendering pipeline.
Mostly, I think it'll be fine. Yeah, I will say on the control side, the Switch the Switch controls for a shooter that's played and balanced for a more traditional controller are different enough where they probably will have to do some things there to make it feel good, if they want to polish to that degree. Because the sticks on the Switch, the throw's different, like they might have to change aim assist and some of the curves and stuff. So
sure.
But largely I think that one will actually probably port over pretty well. And I don't, to his question on sort of like, do we worry about that? I don't. I mean, I think a product's vision has a lot to do with the platform as well. And so I think if the vision needs to shift a little bit to play well on the platform, then I'd rather that be the case. Being, more transparent to players, I don't know. I think a lot of people don't necessarily care that much about what the details are. I do appreciate, like, they also just recently kind of gave more details on Diablo 2, the Resurrected. And, I'd really appreciate when, they give you a mode where you can see the old version, or that they say like that this is going to be very accurate to the original version, and they're kind of being, and because that particular game is, a beloved game where I think if they went too far astray, then people would get upset. So I know that's why they were doing that. So I do appreciate the extra information, but I think every little detail, and it's not, at least for me, not that important. But as long as the product on the platform that is the new product on the new platform is coming out on is, as long as that's good, I don't mind.
I did want to at least point out with Beamdog that Trent Oster was one of the founding members of. He's the president or CEO of Beamdog. He's whatever. He's the top Beamdog, as it were. And I don't know how much of the rest of the staff was involved with Baldur's Gate, if any, but he certainly was. So that was part of his vision for this new company, Beamdog, was to get these titles that he had some connection with in the past, polish them up, and get them out. Get them out again so people of a new generation could enjoy them. Which I think is a valuable thing to do.
Yeah. I mean, there's also there's iOS versions of these games too, these enhanced editions, which is like a whole nother, bring it to a whole new platform, and that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that's got to be a difficult thing to do. I think about it. That's got to be pretty hard. That particular transition has to be pretty difficult.
I don't even know. Yeah, I don't even know. I'm wondering if maybe story mode was not in the original. It must not have been.
It was not. Yeah. No, that's new as well. And again, that just opens the audience as well. I think that's fine. And honestly, I don't. For a number of things. I mean, it's still possible to run the original. As it was, exactly as it was. So it's still available if you want to do that. It comes with your copy. Somebody had sent email in explaining how to get it. If you find the old CDs, they still also run. That's not, it's not like they've been erased. So, the historians can still go and find them. Our industry does generally not do that particularly well, however. Everything becomes obsolete, and it's hard to play older games. As sometimes we look at games and boy, it would be fun to play that one. I think the hardest one thus far that we played was like Soul Reaver was kind of tough to play because I first started trying to play it on the PC and it just was not. Or maybe I can't remember what the issue was, but it just did not play well on the first thing I tried it on.
Populous, the beginning was a nightmare for me to get going. That was the worst one. Yeah, but I did get it going. But it was like all sorts of crazy mod and ionize and stuff.
Yeah, they can be, everything can be a little, yeah, I mean, computers move, operating systems move pretty fast, and we're a long ways away from some of these games, and it's hard to run them, and it is unfortunate that we don't do a better job of preserving things for history, but a lot of it's just product, as well. It's kind of like, it's just not, it's an artistic form, but not everything in it is artistic. So I don't know. I'm not precious about it. It's interesting for us. Obviously, this is what we do on the podcast every week, to look back at these things and talk about them and how they changed and shaped the industry and all of that. But sometimes we're squinting, to see. And of course, this time we missed some things that were different.
Made assumptions. Yeah.
Yep.
Wow. Big mailbag. Nice.
Big mailbag. Yeah. We're all caught up. Thanks for all the emails again to devgameclub@gmail.com. And of course, I already mentioned the reviews earlier. We love to see them. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com. or on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
Of course, you can also find him streaming at the same place on Twitch, where he is, you're now on to Hitman 3, I believe.
Yes, mere minutes from now, I will be starting, from when we're recording at least. Monday, I'm going to be...
Yeah.
I will have had, I'm caught up.
People can catch up on the VODs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's still a few obviously archived episodes from the previous. I actually am gonna. I had some people say that they would watch them on YouTube if they were available, so I'll probably put them up because I've been saving them. But yeah, I'm playing Hitman 3 finally. So my journey to the modern era has begun, or the beginning of the end has started, and so yeah, I'm excited. I'm really excited about Hitman 3. So that'll be starting tonight.
Cool. We'll have a good time hitting men. And I have occasionally been on Twitch at Brett Duville. I did not get on there last week. I don't know about this week either. We'll see. I've got a lot going on. So we'll see. Subscribe, I guess, and you'll get the emails. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton, commissioned by friend of the cast Aaron Evers, and our new logo is by Mark Garcia. Have fun emptying your mailbags this week. And good night.
Good night.